Something in his setup is broken. Oh, apparently because I forgot to change back. We're live already. Um,
Oh, awesome.
as of a few seconds ago. Um, yeah, Emo has had some technical difficulties with hosting, so until he gets them worked out, I'm being the driver.
Okay.
So, hello everyone. Welcome to a Thursday edition. As you can see, people like painting things red, so we didn't quite get to the no red state that we wanted to. So we will kick off with apparently a complicated one. Low-level API support for Objective-C scenarios. 44659er. Aaron, talk to me.
Okay, this is not going to be fun. So just set the tone here. Basically, this is around trying to get close to how we do interop in the COM world, but apply it to Objective-C. That was the real goal. Like, let's just make it as simple as possible and symmetrical. And there are issues there, particularly around existing scenarios that we don't necessarily want to break because of the existing pattern in Xamarin. So because of those constraints, the API surface is a bit less high level and a bit more low level. The result of that is a series of static functions that impact a global state of the runtime, and an attribute that allows us to, as efficiently as possible, know when a type is involved in this type of Objective-C interop. So that's kind of the scope. An example of this is, if we, like, for example, if we were to own the entire interop hierarchy, we could say, well, the base type is X, so we know exactly what to do with it. We know it's a part of the Objective-C interop layer. But because of impacting this type hierarchy is a non-trivial exercise, particularly from a compatibility standpoint, we've added an attribute. And on type load, we look at the type that's loaded, we see this attribute, and we set a bit. And so we've circumvented changing the type system by adding an attribute. So that's what that first attribute does. It tells us that this type is involved in the Objective-C interop layer.
Okay, just as a I don't know what all complexities would be involved in the hierarchy, but inserting a base class is generally not a breaking change. So we could throw something at the bottom of all of these types if that makes the world more sane.
Can you? Sorry, I think I missed what you're.
Well,
I'm trying.
so maybe the problem is
mean
versioning, but like if we had a .NET 6 version of, I don't know, Potato Cannon, and it said that it has as a base class, or that it extends, Objective-C object. Like we could insert that in the .NET 6 definition, even if it wasn't there in the .NET 5 definition, and as long as you end up unified to the .NET 6 or 7 or wherever we're talking about for this universe, you would see that it's an Objective-C based thing. Because whether it's painting an attribute or adding a base type, it still won't work for older types unless we have an injection system. So I'm just making sure, like, don't change the universe, but like there are some things we can do that change the universe that don't break the universe, and so I'm just seeing if they were considered.
Sure. Yeah, they were considered. This is the other factor here is the existing code generation logic that exists for Xamarin.
Okay.
Adding that type into that hierarchy was considered too much
okay.
of an impacting change. So yes, your point is fair. I think Jan brought that up as well. It's like we could put this in the base and it will just inherit, and it's not going to hurt anything. It's not going to be a breaking change for existing binaries, but the impact to the system was deemed too expensive.
Okay.
So that's where that
Yeah.
attribute comes from.
To be fair, right, like, the design of this API is kind of, based on kind of, these negotiations and compromises, right? I think, for the code generation, like all the Objective-C types really inherit from some base type, right? So to mark the base types with this attribute is about as impactful a code generation change as, changing the base type to something else. But, we kind of negotiated to end up with attributes. So we can certainly put it into nodes that, maybe the base type would be better. And, do we really understand that it attribute makes the code generation that simpler? Yeah.
Okay, I was just making sure we didn't end up with something complicated because of of out of ignorance, I guess, of making sure of like, oh, the types already exist and we can't add base types. It's like, well, we can, we just have to do it right. And Jan's one of the people who knows how to tell us how to do it right. So
yeah, and like having the base type would make the rest of the APIs kind of cleaner, because of like one of the APIs that we look later at takes basically object as an argument, but it basically requires that object to be marked with this attribute, right? So if we instead have that API taking the strongly type base type, it would be cleaner. So
Right. So I guess that is a good important thing. A lot of the API design was a negotiation between existing tooling and what they were willing to change to move over to what this system, to the core CLR. So that attribute indicates the inclusion into the interop, the Objective-C interop system. And now we get into the actual static functional components here. We've named this bridge. This is the reason this is named bridge is because we are trying to support almost a single system, and that is the Xamarin interop for the existing Xamarin interop for Objective-C. And that's what they call this component. And so following that logic, we named it bridge. So
their bridge also compilers. No, are you compiler services? Interop services Objective-C bridge?
No, this is a native. It's all native.
Okay.
This is.
Just some points about the naming, right? Like one question is whether it's really worth having a new namespace for this, because there will be maybe like one or two types in it ever, right? Whether we should just make it, Objective-C support in the system runtime interrupt services Marshall, the system runtime interrupt services namespace, right? That's a point to consider. I know that we tend to kind of we tend to avoid namespaces with just one or very few types. So,
Is it only Objective-C? Like Swift? Can I interrupt with Swift at all with this?
There is going to be some overlap, but it's going to be different.
Basically, the point of this API, it's like it's not kind of the primary point of the design was to make something that allows the existing Xamarin interop to work without breaks, right? So the design is that was like number one goal for the design, right? The existing Xamarin interop is based on the mono embedding API, so it's basically reaching out to the guts of the mono runtime to do what it needs. We wanted to kind of have something that's, a smaller surface, and that we can kind of declare, hey, this is the API for the Objective-C interop support to work with. So this was kind of the minimal set we came up with that met the constraints, right?
It really is very targeted at the Xamarin. Like, honestly, if we wanted to, we could literally call this Xamarin Bridge interop. Like it is that tailored. I mean, you could absolutely use this API and replicate the Xamarin Bridge as it exists, but you would basically need to follow its design, which may or may not be the best design, but it is literally enabling a very specific targeted scenario. So to that end, the name of the class aside, the first function we have is the callbacks, and this is very much related to what Jan is referring to as the trying to project, or the trying to project what the mono embedding API delivers in a managed API surface, and it's the minimum set to need that is needed that just doesn't exist in any other way. And this one is about specific callbacks during garbage collection that are needed to track these interop objects across the boundary. And they're global. They are specific for the Xamarin Bridge because of how it was designed, but this is largely correct. If we could have changed a lot more, this would have been all internal implementation detail. If we had like our base type and all these other things, we could have actually done this under the covers. Initialize the reference tracking, begin and end when that reference tracking occurs. These are just callbacks. Is reference callback? If everybody's familiar with the ref counted GC handles that we use in comm interop, that is the callback for every object. And the tracked object has entered the finalizer or finalization queue. That is the next callback. And these are all unmanaged type. These are all unmanaged functions that will be provided by the Xamarin Bridge. And these will be called at the appropriate time to enable that lifetime tracking.
I mean, I'm just curious. It doesn't really impact the API, but I assume that tracked object entered finalization is before you return the callback, the native side should be done with it because we're about to consider everything dead? Or does it just say, like, this now begins when the managed code no longer cares about this object and native can do whatever it wants? I'm just curious what it means.
It means that the object has been deemed unreachable, and so the GC is going to insert it into the finalization queue to be executed on the finalizer, which means it has been promoted, and it will be run. The next time it's observed in managed code will be when the finalizer on it is called.
Will all of these have finalizers? So if it was because if we're not enforcing a base class, then there's not an enforcement of a finalizer, or at least a custom finalizer. So is this just you're in that late stage of garbage collection and the managed code is about to not care? So be aware the managed code is about to not care?
This case, so to answer your first question, yes, all types in this system, because of how Xamarin was designed, the Xamarin interop was designed, will have a finalizer.
Okay.
That is true. But by design, there is nothing enforcing that, as you point out, right? We can't enforce that, but that is how it is designed.
Fair enough.
So one question I have is, so what kind of infrastructure is calling these APIs? Is this kind of like a kind of a managed wrapper around some Objective-C APIs that basically deals with the, interop to Objective-C? Is that kind of, because I mean they seem like very runtime specific APIs. So why are these public? I guess is my question.
You cut out there, Emo. Sorry, what was that last part?
So like they seem like, as Jan discussed earlier, they're kind of like into the guts APIs. So why do they have to be public? Is that because there's like some sort of managed wrapper around Objective-C APIs as Xamarin provides that has to call them, similar to interop or Win32 wrappers? Is that kind of the consumers of this API?
Yes, this is code gen in the Xamarin layer, which is not part of the .NET system, right? It's a completely different I don't know if framework is the right way to put this, but it's at a different layer. It's not built into the system. So providing a public API is the only real way to do that. And they use a ton of code gen that will consume these APIs.
Right. And like the initialized reference tracking, code gen is spitting that into main, basically.
Yes, as early into main as possible.
Yeah.
So it's a bit more similar to what we do for WinRT now, where we pre-generate the projections, basically, right?
Exactly. It's almost identical to that. The one caveat to that is it's exposing a bunch of low-level constructs that we didn't have to expose in WinRT because of we could expose COM wrappers, and it has that whole hierarchy and base that we are allowed to control. In this case, that wasn't possible for the previous constraints discussed, and so we had to expose some of these low-level, call-outs and APIs to kind of shim what the mono embedding API was providing.
But I guess it is fair to say that. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
So it is fair to say then the consumers of this API is basically mostly code that we generate, right? It's not really consumers who manually code against these APIs, right? At least, it's possible, but it's not the expectation, right?
This API is called not by the auto-generated code, right? There's like the Xamarin has like library that's encoded, right? And the code gen basically targets that library, right? And most of these APIs are actually not directly called by the code gen; they are more called by the library.
I see.
But
is it
I
fair
guess
to say
that's
it's like 5 people in the world that call this API, probably, right?
It's one person. It is the Xamarin, and you could absolutely. Yes. How Xamarin is constructed is they have a base library that abstracts it all away. But the only thing that is calling it, whether directly or indirectly, is the pre-generated code. That's kind of the point.
Yeah. Okay.
There's like in theory we can make it some sort of internal API, but then we have challenge, how they would kind of get to it because it's kind of for the same reason that ASP.NET targets our public surface, even though we have APIs here and there that are really only useful for ASP.NET, right?
Right. No. Yeah. I'm just wondering how much scrutiny do we have to apply here? Because I guess based on how you described it, it sounds like these APIs are probably longer lived than we want, but there is a chance that some stuff will change because we change the way interop works over time, right? Would be my guess. But I have no objections if there's like 3 people in the world that need to call these APIs. It's a small set of people we have to make happy with this API. Yeah.
So the previous callbacks, we've initialized the system. In this case, we are the create reference tracking handle is more or less what is involved. It is the GC handle that comes out of that create reference tracking handle is more or less what is involved and represents those callbacks that are above. The native side through directly, indirectly calls create reference tracking handle with an object. You could conceive of that as an RCW type thing. And we return 2 things: a GC handle that represents the actual handle to that object, and that will be a small amount of scratch memory. In this case, the need was 2 pointers worth was enough for what was needed. We originally had 1. There was additional memory that was needed, so we made it 2 pointers. That memory that is returned is what is passed through to the isReferenced callback and the tracked object enter finalization callbacks. As you see, they both take int pointers and return something or nothing. But the input to the isReferenced callback and the tracked object entered finalization is that scratch memory. And the reason we do that is because these are unmanaged these are like native callbacks. So we can't pass a pointer to an object, a managed object. So we need something that is stable. And that is what that scratch memory is. And so that's why it's scratch. They can put whatever they want in there, and it is the onus is on them to say, I can identify this object through this scratch memory, however it is, and that is non-movable memory.
Okay, so create reference tracking handle is allocating some amount of memory and then giving a pointer to that. And then they're supposed to pass that into the same place later, or it's just you'll get this same pointer for something else?
So
okay.
they will get that pointer. That's the contract. Like, here is the GC handle. So you have the GC handle, and it's obviously indirect. And that allows you to hold on to it and extend it and play with it however you wish. And there's also this other native memory that is also associated with that. That is what we will use to pass to your reference tracking callback and your tracked object entered finalization, so that's how you know how to track it.
Okay.
And when I call it multiple times, do I get back the same GC handle, or do I get a new one every single time?
That should be documented. I know I played with that. Right. Calling this function multiple times with the same object will return a new handle, but the same scratch will be returned.
Okay.
Okay, so the one thing that I worry about here, aside from the fact that we just last week had the first thing that wanted to use the word scratch, and then we decided since it was a word that had not been used in API, we were going to replace it. So we'll come back to that. Is if this started off as needing 1 pointer's worth of memory and now it needs 2 pointers worth of memory, if we end up with a Xamarin from .NET 8 that runs on .NET 6, there's no clear communication of bounds in this, so I think it should either be outing a span, or it should take as an input how much space do they want.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. It seems like today you return 2 pointers worth, but then what happens when you ever decide no, it needs 3? So
yeah, so the Xamarin
a bit like
from .NET 8 would just be writing 3, but it only owned 2 of them. So something needs to communicate that.
Okay, that's fair. Part of the reason that this was done with 2 is because 1 pointer is absolutely needed because of how that's the minimum, right? The second pointer was, if you need more, we're allowing the caller to allocate extra if they want. They have a place for it. So with that extra pointer location, they can allocate whatever they wish.
Sure.
So that was kind of the 2 is enough because it will scale however they want. Regardless if the runtime allocates it or they allocate it, someone needs to allocate memory.
Right.
And allocating 2 is the minimum that we can and allow as much as you wish.
Meaning it would never go to 3, because if you needed a third pointer, then what you store in the second pointer is your pointer to your 2 pointers worth of memory.
Right, exactly. That was the logic.
Yeah, I think there's a book somewhere called Famous Last Words, though. But
Is it like we don't have like hard constraint in the runtime to allocate 2, right? We basically have the constant to hard code it somewhere, right?
Okay, I can so there. That's some implementation detail. That's true. In order to do this, I can actually, because of where this memory is located, it doesn't require me to allocate any extra memory. 2 is actually, because I actually have space on the sync block, so I can just say, here's 2 blocks, here's 2 pointers, and I know I never have to allocate. I never have to allocate again. I could absolutely do what you're saying, Jan.
No, so I think we can communicate that and have a little bit of future proofing here of just if we out span of int pitter, then it tells you straight up, here's where it lives, because you can ask for the pointer or the ref or whatever you want from the span, and here's how many I gave you. And we've just communicated in the C API. It happens to always be linked to, but like it's here you go. Here are your 2 bytes. It is a pointer and a bounds. So I think we would just change it to outspan. Span of int pitter, because it's really out of void star, but we can't do that. So
does Xamarin actually use both of those pointers today in the prototype?
Yes.
Okay.
I guess to be for full transparency, I believe they only use 2 bytes of the extra pointer. They don't even need a full one, but I was like, I don't even know how to allocate that, so I'll just give you 2 pointers.
And as you said, 2 pointers means that they can handle the indirection to have needed more than a pointer's worth. So.
Yeah, to me, the problem with the design is not 2 pointers or 3 pointers. It's more, as Jeremy said, like what happens if we change our mind, right? Like if eventually we reach a point where we say, oh, everybody needs 3 pointers, and we don't want to pay for the indirection for every single object. You know, maybe we now have 3 pointers somewhere. Then that would be unfortunate. And that's what I meant by famous last words, because.
Got it. Got it. So your point is just like, let the API not just return an int pointer, but also how much it's giving explicitly. Okay, that's fair. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and having it just as this is what the runtime gives you, and you have to deal with it, seems nicer with regards to this paragraph, because otherwise you'd have great, you called me before with 2, and now you called me with 3, and I can't give you the same thing. All right. So. Scratch
my
memory.
other question is, so the previous API, like I just realized that because you don't call it with an object, can you call initialize only once, and then second calls are arrows basically, or can you have multiple initializations and they all get called?
Right. Yep. It's only called once.
He documented that in the exceptions. It's a call it once in main, and you now are the bridge. Thing.
And then this API here calling it multiple times is not an error, because like is it really correct to get different GC handles to the same object reference?
If it goes multi-threaded, probably, because that's each upref and downref, I think. Or is GC handle something different?
I don't. Yes, it is, because Xamarin has the concept of if they determine that. Sorry, Xamarin has the concept of we don't care if we have to create a new wrapper. We're absolutely fine with it. They will get rid of wrappers immediately and just create a new one right off if they want. And so they just will literally call this again if they believe that they need one.
Okay, that doesn't create leaks.
No.
Right, and so with I guess it really, covered it here with the paragraph of, you'll know you've received a second one if your span is not 0 filled.
Basically, yeah.
Because you're promising it's 0 if this is the first time it was called, and it's whatever the last caller did if it's not.
And that gets back to the very ugly, I think, this is a global thing. Like there's just literally one API that does all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have initialized, you're clearly owning the entire interop story here. So the only person that has touched that scratch memory, which whatever memory, that extra memory is you.
Yeah.
And you tell me what you want for scratch. I use that because that's just how I would call it. I don't have no dog in this fight.
Yeah, what did we decide? And I'll have to check the emails again.
Well, the other one was initial buffer because it represented the starting memory for a growable thing. Yeah, I mean, it seems like this is the indirection buffer. Because you write down the pointer of what the native memory is here, so this is the right.
Could it be associated buffer?
We can call it associated buffer.
Works for me. I mean, other words we use is like state, tag, right? These are the common things for, an indoor a pointer worth of custom state that somebody wants to track with something, right? So associated buffer seems fine.
Or even tagged memory. I'm actually fine with that. That seems reasonable.
You slightly cut out. What was the before memory?
A tagged memory is absolutely fine. Whatever.
Yeah, I'm okay with anything that doesn't use Scratch. So if tagged makes sense in context, then we get to go great. It's interop. We don't care. Scratch is just when it's weird. All right, tagged memory. All right, and just making sure that you intended, this is bridge plus message send function. It is a nested enum, not a namespace enum.
Yes.
Okay. That's fine.
I did that.
I am simply
I
making sure that we are reviewing what is intended, and it wasn't some copy paste errors.
Nope. I did. That is nested. I admit I've never read the parts of the guidance on enums, so that's on me. Perhaps that is not a good practice.
The quick summary is if more than 6 people are going to call your API and need to pass in this enum or read the value of it, it needs to not be nested. Otherwise, nest it so that we have fewer things in top-level namespaces. So you did the right thing.
Got it. Okay.
I guess if it needs to be used across multiple types, it obviously shouldn't have been nested in one of them. But
Agreed.
But yes, we've recently started saying no one cares about this. Just shove it in as a nested enum, and let's stop polluting IntelliSense.
Yeah, in this case, I don't really care because it's all interop anyway. So like once you open that namespace, you are drinking from the fire hose. So it's
Well, but right now. And I have a note that we can circle back to it. Right now, it's in a tiny little namespace with these 2 types, and but we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I followed this link. It didn't actually go anywhere that I interpreted as useful, but I will admit that the documentation basically says, Jeremy, you're not smart enough to read this. Because it's a void, and then says see also other things that use similar words that you did. So.
Okay. This is okay. We're gonna have a great lesson in how Objective-C works. It's a message passing logic, which basically means instead of having a vtable, it uses message passing, and what that means is. Every object. So this object is specifically. This function is a standalone C. Is just basically a standalone C function, and you pass in an object identity, and you pass in the name of the function that you're interested in. In this case, it's really a message, and the message is the function. name, the name that is what. And so what happens is I have my object, and I say foo, and it's literally, does this object respond to message named foo? Does that make it's the way of making, it's basically duck typing. Do you respond to foo? You respond to foo. Great, I love it. Here you go. So the strong typing doesn't necessarily exist. If you have a type that has two messages, and you have another instance that implements one of those messages, it will respond to it. So that type enforcement is handled at the compiler level, not necessarily at the runtime level, if that makes sense. And so this allows for a lot of flexibility with C interop from Objective-C standpoint. So what this basically says is, I would like to, this function is documented as taking void and returning void. But that's really not its signature, because it's just a trampoline. You cast message send to the signature that you want to send to. The only contract in Objective-C, and this is purely a very loose contract, is the first argument is a pointer to the object that you're interested in, and the second argument is the message that you want to send,
which is the dispatch call,
which is the name of the function. Yes. Yeah. And then after that what are the arguments that you're passing to this message? So you could, if you have an int, you cast it to pointer int. If it has a double, pointer double. That's what you cast it to.
Glad you do this and not me.
So that's what send message kind of does. Here's where it gets more complicated. That's message send. Message send is very straightforward. But
meaning
because of
the first entry in the CNUM.
Yes.
Okay.
Very, very simple. And so the other ones are largely the same concept, but they're for the special cases. So if you return a floating point number, you use message send fpret. And the compiler knows all this. This is like the Objective-C compiler figures this out and does all this. If you wanted to do this yourself from C and you wanted to interact with Objective-C, you have to know to call the appropriate message send. Because in Objective-C, nobody explicitly calls message send. They have their own syntax. stret, you're returning a structure. It's message send, but the return value is a structure. The other two are if you are doing basically inheritance. So you don't want to send the message. You don't want to send the message to yourself. You want to send the message to what you've inherited from.
Basically these are kind of the low-level Objective-C helper APIs, right? I think the more important thing to talk about is why we have them here.
It's I mean, like, really, it's just of the little bit that we want to talk about, right? It's like I saw there's a link. I went to the link. It says it's void, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. And then so is pret and stret and superstret. Like, are those good names? But really, looking at it, it's just you took their underscores with camel cases and you Pascal cased and got rid of the underscores.
Yes.
And I think we can rubber stamp that.
I'm ideally, this is if you are an Objective-C developer or interested in Objective-C interop, you know what these mean. I don't know if that's a sufficient argument, but that's what I thought. So I guess Jan's point, why do these exist? These exist because of, I don't know. These exist because of, go ahead.
I can talk to it. It's basically like, you can actually do DL import against these APIs just fine, right? You can just have your arbitrary assembly, do DLL import and do pinvoke to Objective-C message send. That's all good and fine. What the Xamarin historically has done, they actually hijack these interop, these DLL import APIs to do special things for these. For basically, they routed it to some their own implementation that wraps the actual call with something else, right? So basically, like when you do DLL import of the Objective-C message send method in the Objective-C runtime, it doesn't actually, and you are in Xamarin application, it's not going to call actually that that entry point. It's going to call something else, right? So it's basically this, and this behavior is used both by the auto-generated code gen, but it's even documented in kind of the Xamarin documentation where it says if you do DLL import for this thing, it doesn't actually do what it says. It does something else, right? So what this API is for is basically like, allow the Xamarin support library to communicate to the runtime, hey, if you see these DLL imports, here is what to replace them with. That's the whole point of this.
Okay, so this thing that didn't take stuff is go intercept calls to Objective-C message send and instead invoke this function or return this.
Exactly.
Okay. It seems like
It's
this does
specifically when
also
you
need to
do
be called
DLL
pretty
import.
early. Like next to whoever's calling initialize reference tracking, right?
Yeah.
Does it, just to ask questions, does it make sense for initialize reference tracking to just take what are the 5 pointers to replace these with? Instead of having you call initialize plus 5 calls to set message send callback?
So not all these are valid on all platforms. For example, the sendfp red one, it's actually only applicable on x86, I think. And there is a chance that if there is a new platform added, maybe we end up with Objective-C message send stred2 or stred-ex. So having it in enum is kind of a bit more future-proof. I agree with you that taking 5 arguments would be fine too. Just less future-proof. Yeah.
That's fair.
There's also the naming concern for the enum. Instead of MSG send function, message send function, mainly because I think it's set message send callback.
Right. There's inconsistency between the enum name and the API name, right? The enum name says MSG, and the API name spells it in full like message, right? Should that be in sync? Right?
I also put a link in the chat about this message send override using pinvokes if anyone's interested.
Yeah. I mean, again, looking at the notion that no one other than Xamarin is going to call this, and so no one, probably this could be named QWERTY and it would be fine, but I'm personally fine with MSG and the enum name and message spelled out nicely in the static. Does anyone else want to care? Okay. All right. So set message send callback. The host, or that's the term I'm going to invent for them, calls this for each of the things that they think need to be intercepted, and then now we're at send pending exception for thread. Is this a callback into the runtime, or is this a callback into Objective C?
The set message send, the pending exception.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so what this is when Objective C. This is when you're in a native code, particularly Objective C or C, I guess, but it's on an Objective C scenario, and you catch an exception from Objective C, or you would like to propagate an error. You can think of it as H results concepts from COM. You can call and say, as soon as I know that I am at a boundary, I would like to set an exception on this particular as soon as we return, because we're about to return. A good example of this is if you have overridden set message send for some reason, and inside of that handler, you caught an Objective-C exception, you would jump into manage, convert whatever Objective-C exception occurred into an exception, and say, I know for a fact, because I am in my message send override, that I'm about to re-enter managed code. So I've done all the work, I'm propagating an Objective-C exception, and I want, as soon as it returns, to throw. And that's what that does.
Okay, and so this says for thread. Does it mean thread, or async local capture state? And does the one person who needs to call it know what it means and how to use it?
Yes.
Because there's native threads, there's managed threads, and then there's the capture context thing.
This is on the managed thread.
Which is guaranteed to be the same from who calls this and when they go back to native to come back to managed? Because this feels like you went from managed into native, back to managed, and you're saving yourself some state for when you undo that double transition. If I'm wrong, that's fine, but because this is a managed method, it seems like you've done a double hop here before you call this. Otherwise, you would just throw, because you're back in managed.
I see. Got it. Yes, I see what you're getting at there.
I mean, if the answer is yes, thread's the right word, and the runtime handles this, and we're all fine. That's really my question. Yes.
Yes. The tests for it do it exactly what they're supposed to do.
Okay.
I think your point is that is slightly confusing because you're calling in a function to get into a function to set state that isn't what you're interested in. It does the right thing. Yes.
Okay. State is maintained. The universe continues to universe. All right. All right.
So
this one looks exciting.
This one is the worst. This one, I hate this. I had to learn way more things than I wanted to learn with this problem. So what this? Oh, right, that's a delegate. Okay. So what this is the opposite. This is I'm at managed code, and at some point I've thrown an exception, and I'm about to enter, and it's hit, and it's discovered that, wait a minute, I'm about to enter native code. What the heck do I do here? And so in Windows, we'll turn it into an SEH, and Magic happens. In this case, we want the same type of system, we want basically the same type of system, but on Objective-C. And that's because I've thrown a managed exception. It is going, it has hit something, and I expect, because of existing behavior that the mono embedding API enables, I expect that exception to have the opportunity to be converted to
CF error.
Yeah. Or a C++ exception. That's what I want. And this provides a handler for it. And it provides a handler, series of handlers, and you can propagate it however you wish. If you return a handler, and there's a big bunch of comments there, if you provide a handler, you are allowed two options. And I mean it like that. If the handler that you return cannot return, it has to throw, or it has to fail fast. That is it. If you don't return anything, the behavior is as if you did not, as if the behavior is what it currently is. If you do not.
Okay, so the handler has to throw native, or the handler has to throw managed and set thrown native? You said the handler has to throw, but the handler... I can't tell. Is the handler native code or managed code?
The handler is native code, and the delegate unmanaged int pointer void. That's what that is.
Okay.
So yeah, this is kind of convoluted, but
I have yet to learn how to read that syntax, so I have to ask.
Right. Okay.
those
So
questions.
that syntax that was a bit of a mind bend right there. So it basically says this is a delegate. Unhandled exception propagation handler is a defined delegate. This delegate is called because it is asking the supplier to say, I have an exception. It is about to cross into a native boundary. I'm giving you the exception. I'm giving you a runtime handle to the last method that was called, so you don't have to spend the cost of walking the stack in the exception. You have an option here. You can give me a function pointer that has to be unmanaged, and a context that I will pass to it. You can put whatever you want in there, whatever details you need to construct your Objective-C exception, and I will call that in the appropriate context. And from that function pointer, you need to either throw a native exception that will propagate properly into the native environment, or you need to record it, log it, do whatever you want, and then fail fast. Because if you don't fail fast, the runtime is going to fail fast.
Okay, and I'm just trying to understand how it works. If you've handled it and you've called, Objective-C dispatch exception, however that works, from the callback, you did that in the function that the callback returned the delegate to. How does, you did that simply that now you've returned, and that the managed code just assumes that you did that and goes on a happy day, or is it already in and I've rethrown and torn down the state, or?
Yeah, exactly. So during the multiple passes that we do during exception handling, we determine the state, and we say someone has thrown an exception. We will unwind the managed frames as if an exception goes all the way up to the native frame. We will set it up just as if you had called this native function, this native callback that will throw. So we reset the state of the stack so that the callback, the unmanaged function pointer that you called, can safely throw an exception. or fail fast. We're not required there, but that's it. That's why it honestly, if we could, this unmanaged that takes an int pointer and returns a void, if we had an attribute that said no return, that would be appropriate there. I don't know if that helps.
Right.
Okay. But so our runtime is in C and is not aware of Objective-C. But somehow this plays with Objective-C throwing and the right number of the right things will happen. Like, because it feels like our runtime is going to continue executing after this thing happens. Like, we had a callback and we're going to do something.
So
if it hijacks the thread entirely, that's fine. Like it jumps past all of our runtime back into some Objective-C thread manager or whatever, then sure.
Yeah, we unwind everything right to the point of the thing that is right above this unmanaged callback that we have called is the native frame that called into the reverse P invoke. I think Alexi also has a question.
I wanted to try to explain maybe the motivation for this. So the idea is basically we want core CLR and the Objective-C exception handling to cooperate to propagate an exception. So the idea is that core CLR will unwind as far as it can go, which is this boundary where we know that the caller was an Objective-C function. And at that point, core CLR doesn't know anything about how do I unwind an Objective-C frame? Do I need to clean up any resources, etc.? So the motivation for this callback is then you hand off the managed exception in some way. It gets encapsulated in some sort of Objective-C exception, and then the Objective-C throw mechanism will unwind its code. And at some point, you hit another boundary, possibly, where you go from Objective-C back into managed. That's where
what I'm worried about.
The previous API would, unbundle the Objective-C exception, extract the managed exception, and possibly let it rethrow. So the idea is that the Objective-C runtime and core CLR are cooperating to unwind this thing past a mixed stack of managed and unmanaged methods. Does that make sense?
Okay, so I think the problem that I was having is I was thinking too globally of the managed code calls native code, which calls managed code, which throws and then hits this unwind, and I'm wondering how the runtime resumes. And the answer is however the native code said to do so. So that basically the handler said I was called from an Objective-C context, I throw an Objective-C exception, I hit an Objective-C catch that says keep going, I hit ret, that means I pop back from the native into managed transition, and whatever the logic says to do that, does that. So
right, so like that native code that caught this exception could have frames above it, and maybe that code will call set message pending exception for thread.
Okay.
And continue that propagation.
Okay, so I guess I was just confused. I think I got confused by the you must fail fast or throw I'm like, but if it throws we're going to pop back into managed code and do something, what's going to happen? And the answer is no. The throw was only concerned with right now, and now the rest of the native context deals with this. You should just play nicely with your environment. You know who you are, do the right thing. Okay.
Yeah.
That
interrupt.
makes sense to me. Yeah.
Do the right
thing.
Try to do the right thing.
So that explains the semantics of the delegate, and now we see that this is exposed as an event, which means it's multiple dispatch. So do we really want it to be an event, or do we want it to just be a single delegate?
I had originally had this as a set. It looked kind of weird. You couldn't call it multiple times, a bunch of things. So because again, it's a global thing. I can imagine having a sequence of, I guess, a couple handlers because you can filter based on what you see, because those right, and as long as you return a null, we'll move on. So I could see the system registering maybe 2 or 3 of these handlers depending on what they want.
But I would expect the Xamarin will only ever register just 1, right? The thing about this API, we were throwing the idea of, hey, this is like really general purpose thing. It's not really tied to Objective-C much. Should it be a general purpose API on, say, system.runtime interop services Marshall? But it's like it doesn't feel quite right. So we are basically like we ended up kind of in the middle where we kind of made the API a bit more general purpose than it needs to be, but we didn't make the final leap. Okay, put it actually in the general purpose, interop type, so.
And if there are no handlers or no handlers that return non-null, then we fail fast?
The current behavior, yes.
Yeah, it's unhandled exception, fail fast, generate dump, whatever, right?
Because the weird, my recollection of events, I don't remember if they're a list or a queue. Sorry, that's the same thing. I don't remember if they're a stack or a queue. So I don't know if the last one to register thinks that they get the most control, or if the first one to register wins. If we really feel like it's only going to be 1, then and they're never going to unregister it effectively. Again, my suggestion would be that we move it as a parameter in initialize. It's a thing you're only supposed to call once. We expect you're always going to do it. Let's just make it a parameter there, and if we come up with a different kind of exception handler, then we make another API. Like, we just overload initialize with, I have a different notion of a handler now. Because it's really, the problem with designing general use API is if we're only really looking at how Xamarin binds into Objective-C with this, and we're not also modeling with, replacing COM with actually calling these APIs, we don't know if what we're adding is actually helpful or if what we're adding is actually just getting in our way of doing whatever the next one is. So I'm kind of just trying to apply the KISS principle.
I have no gripe with passing this into the initialize function. I think that's reasonable. I will say that, I don't see why that would be a problem.
Right, because the set pending exception for thread is, that one is you're supposed to call it multiple times of, go register a thing or clear a thing, or, and it's thread local instead of global, and so that makes sense to be a function. But the other half here of hey, I'm taking over interop with, in this case, Objective-C, here is how I handle things. Seems like it's all that you're saying. And so I think it's part of initialize. Okay, I see closed curlies.
See, simple.
Yeah, so now
Trivial.
we only have 2 things left. So, Emo, you pay attention to user experience way more than I do. If we're searching, if IntelliSense is back to defaulting to search across all namespaces, is bridge too generic a word? And if we're not doing that, is bridge still maybe too generic a word?
So I think the question, I think is kind of one thing we could do is just prefixing both types with obj-c or Objective-C, right? Which at that point, to Jan's earlier question, can we just merge it with the interop namespace? That seems like a reasonable thing, in which case both are sufficiently disambiguated already, right? If we leave it in the Objective-C namespace, then, I mean, so to be clear, like IntelliSense no longer defaults to searching across all namespaces. They removed that because it created too much noise. But what you basically can now do is if you do, there's control space, which is autocomplete, and then there's control J, which is basically, show the autocomplete window. And if you hit control J again, basically then it searches across all namespaces. So normally what you do is you do control J again, and then it searches everywhere. So you're explicitly opting into the behavior to see everything. There's also an icon at the bottom that you can toggle with the mouse that basically does that. So it shouldn't be surprising for people, but I think our general guidance is we try to avoid single term names, especially when they have generic names, because they have a high chance of colliding. And I would argue the noun bridge is not specific enough. Like, I mean, somebody will have a bridge that has nothing to do with Objective-C, right?
Okay,
so I would avoid that.
Yeah. I guess I don't know what the shape of things in interop services look like, but I assume that they're amongst the least .NET-y names that we have. So I'm fine with your suggestion of take the Objective-C sub namespace and turn it into OBJ, or big O, little b, little j, big C prefix on these two types.
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, even if we spell it out, it's also fine. I mean, it's not that nothing here gets pretty.
What is the? Can someone elaborate on the lack of namespace? Like, I feel like the namespace is the appropriate mechanism here. We have interop services.javascript. Like, I could see interop services.swift or interop services.
Sure, I mean,
Python.
we can leave it here and prefix the types. That is also a thing.
But I see.
So to be clear, so the problem, there's like two orthogonal decisions. One of them is there enough meat here to warrant its own namespace? And that's kind of a decision we can take one way or the other. I don't have strong feelings. I mean, we do have a Windows runtime namespace, for example. So having an Objective-C namespace wouldn't be a terrible idea, in my opinion. Now, if there's only ever going to be two types in it, then yeah, it is a bit wasteful to put it there. On the other hand, interop namespaces is like, it's super large namespace. So everything you add there is just, you put it on the pile basically, right? So it makes it somewhat harder for you to find stuff, but maybe that's okay. I mean, the general rationale why you may still want a prefix is that people don't see namespaces, right? Like if you edit in the code file, you have, multiple usings at the very top of the file, and then everything just shows up across those namespaces, right? So for example, if you do interop, you very likely have a using for interop namespaces, there's probably more than one. And now you may have to deal with the fact that, names that may sound reasonable when you're aware which namespace they're in no longer look reasonable because you have no idea which namespaces they're coming from. They just pop up in IntelliSense now as top level items, right? And so that's why, you should have names that by themselves make sense, because I mean, same thing when you're on GitHub, right? You're looking at a code review. Somebody takes a method that takes a bridge, for example. Okay, bad example because it's a static type, but you could imagine when you look at a method signature, you have no idea which namespace that type came from, right? And so you still want names that make sense. And so that's why, we generally avoid like single noun type names for that reason, because the nouns are usually too, unspecific, like, think node or tree or item. They almost are, doomed to have collisions, right? And that's why you usually want to add something else to it. And when you have like, two nouns, you're already usually sufficiently, disambiguated. The only exception to the rule is like core platform concepts like array, span, index, range. That's where we take single noun words, because we also usually expect people will build higher level concepts that have to also include that name somewhere. And if the base name already is like 3 letters long, like 3 words long, then the compound words become ridiculously long, right? But I think for things like here, it completely makes sense to me to say, yeah, you have an Objective-C bridge, and that might be in an Objective-C namespace, but that to me is not redundant. That's just the way things work.
Yeah. As a similar, we have a namespace. I mean, so yeah, XML node is in an XML namespace where it got the repeat. In ASN tag is the name of a type in system formats ASN1. and it has the prefix just because, yeah, again, if you're using it, you'll have, the 6 usings at the top of your file, and then it's tag. Well, was that a collision across any of your other 5 namespaces? Maybe. So, yeah. So
Yeah.
I think that at least bridge we would want to put Objective C in front of.
Can I let me challenge that only because
Okay.
I hear what I absolutely get what you're saying, but here's where I would say this is perhaps different, because whatever file you have, you are likely, this is a building block, you are likely building up a system. So you're not going to have system runtime interrupt services.objective-c, system runtime services.javascript. And if you are, you likely you have the opportunity to make type aliases. Like, we have these tools that allow you to build these constructs, but if there's symmetry across all of them and say, this is the bridge, and if I am in Objective-C world, I just want to use the bridge because that's what I'm focusing on. If I am doing an interop between Objective-C and JavaScript and there is a collision, I want to be able to specifically do that because it's a very special case. And I'll use an alias. So I almost think that namespace is serving its function in this case, and it does allow that narrow.
I mean, what you're saying is not wrong. It's just that I think, like, there are some examples where what you said is true in the sense where, the namespaces are mutually exclusive, right? You're not very likely to write code that uses both Objective-C and JavaScript in the same file, right? Because you're clearly writing interop for one of them and not, both of them usually, right? But like that's usually not true for most .NET stuff, right? So it's completely reasonable to use an as-in-one reader and an XML document at the same time, because I parse my config file and I construct some as-in file, right? And so at that point, because of this mixing and matching in .NET, that's why we try to avoid conflicts in the common cases, because while you can declare aliases, it just generally sucks, right? And it's not like something you basically want to do every single time. Like in your case here, I mean, symmetry is good, but keep in mind symmetry can be also achieved just using a naming convention or a suffix, right? If you call something Objective-C bridge, and then the corresponding other namespace you call it the JavaScript bridge, you also have symmetry, right? But then you effectively prescribe what these aliases are, right? But yeah, I don't feel super strongly on the collision here. It's like I don't expect people to have namespaces for Objective-C or even interrupt namespaces if you put it in the root. So to me, if you insist on bridge, I mean, that's fine. I don't think I have a strong allergic reaction to that.
Yeah, the rules we have for the names and name collisions, this is off the top of my head, I'm not looking at what we have written down, is if the name is absolutely the best name for a thing, so like in WinForms there's window, right? It represents a window. It's Win32 calls it a window. Like, window is the absolute best word for this thing.
Except we call it form, but yeah.
Sure. Button. Button is the absolute best word for the thing that is a button. Well, WPF also has a thing called button. But the number of things that will be WinForms and WPF at the same time are essentially 0. And there's not really a thing that we would have because we've just said that a button is only a user experience thing. You would have yet a different thing before button came in as yet another word. But bridge is, to look at bridge in the specific, it could end up being that, bridge makes sense as an interop thing, and bridge makes sense as a game of cards, and it makes sense as you're just connecting any other two components. And so bridge may be a thing that lots of components that have nothing to do with each other and nothing that guarantees mutual exclusion. And so that's where bridge becomes you're not really tied to the concept of Objective-C anymore. It's just a word that you were using to say that you're tying two things together. And so that's why on this one I feel like it wants the disambiguator.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sold on bridge either. More of what I was getting at, I think, is I am somewhat when I see these prefixes, so let's say it's OBJ-C whatever. It's in an Objective-C namespace. It seems redundant to me. It just I very much don't like that. But if that is the policy, I understand it. Like I don't like that redundancy. If we're in a namespace, use the namespace. That's kind of
yeah. To be clear, like we like it's not a hard and fast rule, right? Like I think the problem is kind of as Jeremy's example, it's kind of like a taste thing, right? So button, for example, clearly has a conflict across all GUI frameworks, right? But like if we were to prefix every single UI concept like checkbox, radio button, with like WPF or WinForms, you basically create a very untasteful UI toolkit, right? And so we said like, yeah, while there are collisions, it's just not practical to prefix them all, right? And in this case, button is arguably the best name for the concept. But like, I mean, there's very few examples where that's true. And like the one thing that has bitten us in the past is that many of the namespaces that we regularly contribute to, like collections or the system root namespace, are auto-referenced. And so, for example, we recently had this issue with system text.json where we introduced a node namespace. And fortunately, due to the way the VB binder works, is if you have a local, basically, I forgot how VB calls it, but basically the equivalent of var, I think, in VB. When you have a for loop where you name your for loop variable node, now it starts conflicting with the node namespace, and VB is now generating errors rather than compiling happily, right? And so this is kind of the problem that we have when you have namespaces that everybody imports, and now we insert a name in there that might conflict with user-provided names or other names in other namespaces, then now everybody has to kind of work this around and, come up with some naming convention for that, right? And I think in your case here, yeah, interop namespace is a very specialized namespace. It's only used by very small amounts of people, and there's probably more dragons anywhere, so the naming is the least of your problems. It's just that namespaces are an organizational tool, but most of the time when you look at source code, you don't see the namespaces, right? So in that sense, it's not really redundant, right? Like if you just stare at like 10 lines of code and you see the word bridge, is it obvious that it's the Objective-C bridge? Maybe. I mean, but that seems contextually, right?
Okay,
so
that's
fair. That's kind of why we very often end up with like some prefix notation. But yeah, that's certainly not a hill I want to die on here.
So OBJC bridge or OBJC host, I don't have. I get your argument. I think it's fair. I'm not gonna fight that.
I mean, once you prefix it, I think bridge is fine. I think it's like, because then you're like, you make it clear what kind of bridge you're talking about, right? It's no longer the card game bridge, right?
Okay.
And I mean, yeah, host or bridge. I mean, host is equally undefined, right? Or component or manager or provider, factory, whatever, right? There's all these words that mean nothing without context. So it's fine. In terms of namespaces, yeah, I don't feel strongly. I mean, quite frankly, if we believe there's ever going to be just two types, then putting it in interop services is fine. If this might grow to 20 types, probably worth having its own namespace.
Yeah, if we already have sub namespaces for other particular interop
kind of
things, then
right?
I think just going ahead and creating one now, and if it has two, whatever.
Is there what is the cost? I'm trying to understand what that is. Is that a documentation issue?
No, it's more like, if you look at the way docs are presented, it's like every time you have a namespace, it's just one more item to click on, right? And so the interop services expand on namespace is an anti-pattern because it has exactly one type in it, and it's like, really, we needed a namespace to hold one type. That seems a bit over the top. Like the Windows runtime one is a good one because it has like I think 20 types in it or something, so that's kind of reasonable grouping, right? And interop services itself is a huge namespace, so so it is, again, there's really not a cost to having more namespaces besides cognitive load and like more noise potentially. So it is a taste thing of like, is it worth it, right? Do we need another grouping mechanism or not?
There's also a heuristic, I'm going to say the number 6, but I don't know what the actual number is, of once you have more than that many usings in a file, people consider that your concept is busted and too thin, or too scattershot. Of you didn't build a thing, you built 100 things that you're trying to integrate together. So don't make people do too many namespace imports. Again, in this case, it's not really going to apply, but that would be, for something like JSON of the when do we decide to put something in the JSON namespace versus a sub namespace is. Are most people who use JSON going to want to use it? Then don't make a new namespace.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, it's I would honestly leave it up to you. Like I can go either way on namespace. I mean, one thing that is nice with having a namespace is you have a home to put conceptual docs, right? Because it's kind of, you can put it on the namespace itself. But in your case, given again that you build an API for like literally people that you know by name, it's a bit it doesn't really matter, I guess. It's a very specialized API, so either one is fine. One question on the attribute: should we seal it, or do you expect actual people deriving from it?
Oh gosh, I always forget to do that. I'm sorry. Yes, sealed.
Okay. Sorry, you wrote really nice docs, and so I'm trying to merge your event documentation for a parameter name documentation in the update. I'm not fixing all your docs, just when I got rid of the event. Okay, so track native reference attribute should be sealed.
I can't remember the inherit and the multiple. The inherit, yes. The multiple.
I don't think you need multiple, but we can just explicitly specify it as false. I don't know what the default is. That's why defaults are bad.
I think inherited is true, actually. I think. One of them is true, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, did you want it to be inherited?
Yes.
Because we may as well just be explicit about it. Okay, so bridge. What I wrote down was obj bridge.
Fine.
Are we happy with that? It does look a little funky, but it's going to look a little funky anyway because it ends in a capital C. So.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, it's never going to be pretty.
Do we want to call it actually a bridge? Because there's like a thing on the Xamarin site called Objective-C bridge already.
I see.
So, it's more like for our own kind of clarity, right?
I mean, you could call Objective-C Marshall. I mean,
yeah, like Objective-C Marshall or Objective-C support or whatever. I had kind of mixed feelings about the bridge thing. So I know there's this other thing called bridge.
I really have no strong preference. I think you've all made your arguments, I think, pretty well that having an Objective-C prefix makes sense. I absolutely would not be happy with a class called support. So Objective-C support makes perfect sense to me.
Works for me, yeah. Yeah. Manager, provider.
Again, we always call it like Marshall, right? It's like we have under the Windows runtime namespace, Yeah. And
yeah,
should
Marshall,
it be Objective-C, like full, when the namespace is Objective-C, should it be Objective-C? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we don't save many characters, so like, I think we can also just call it literally Objective-C. That's probably fair as well. I mean, the type is already short anyway, so. What was the Windows runtime one? Yeah, we have Windows runtime Marshall in it, right? So it would make sense to have Objective-C Marshall as the core type name.
We're following patterns. Move this down so my bullets make sense. All right. Did we feel we're keeping the namespace? I think we decided yes.
I mean, I don't know enough about this stuff, right? But it's just it seems like interop is this thing that tends to grow, not shrink. So I mean, unless we're absolutely positive it's ever going to be less than 5 types, I think that doesn't strike me as a terrible idea to have its own namespace.
Yeah, and that's really the position that I think I was falling to. Of it's not really going to hurt too many people to have it, and if we add things later, we'll be like, we should have added the namespace. So let's just add it.
Interop namespaces is a super busy one, so it seems.
Yeah. And there is the point about following patterns, and we kind of have that pattern at least for some already.
At least for the more modern interop ones, you have dedicated namespaces, yeah.
Did I get the right name on that? Yes, I did. All right.
With the attribute, is that attribute ever only going to be Objective-C? The track native reference attribute?
That's a fair question.
So I would say yes for right now. Like the concept that it is trying to represent, I think is something that we will reuse. But I think that this particular instance is worth keeping targeted to Objective-C. I can get into more details on why that is, but this is only for Objective-C, and I think we will want something that says this type, this concept is only for an Objective-C type, if that makes sense. Does that make sense, Eric? Sorry, I mean, I know that was kind of convoluted.
No, it makes sense. Yes, it makes sense. I'm wondering if the rename that Jeremy's proposing.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yes,
And,
I'm having fun with undo and paste. So
the way this attribute is used, it's actually used to tag types, right? So the thing that you are applying it to isn't actually a reference. It's like the Objective-C type, sort of. You know, it's.
I see.
So, I'm not sure whether you have prior art, but Objective-C type, maybe.
Yeah, you could drop native, right? You could just say Objective-C reference attribute.
Yeah.
Or
That's fair.
Objective-C tracked reference or something like that.
I mean, Objective-C type seems more sensible to me because, as Jan said, I mean, you're not putting it on the reference, but you're really putting it on the type. So it's a bit weird to say this is a reference when really you're talking about a type. It's a kind of seems backwards a bit.
Or
I mean,
Objective-C track type, you want to highlight that this is participating in the tracking manner.
Yeah,
I think
that also works.
I like that.
So
I mean, looking at the Windows runtime one,
Yeah.
we didn't really prefix the Windows runtime attributes, but a lot of those actually appear in signatures because you actually put it on parameters. And that kind of makes sense to have shorter names because otherwise signatures become completely unreasonable, right? But versus this one, you actually apply it on the type level, so having a slightly longer name is probably actually desirable. So yeah, I would probably go with a longer one that has Objective-C somewhere in it.
Objective-C tracked type is what I think I heard
that
agreement on.
seems
Looks great.
beautiful.
All right. Any minor dissent? No, I forgot to delete this.
Nope. Perfect. Ship it.
It's definitely not perfect. It's a nightmare, but
Right.
it's way better now. I agree. This has been cleaned up nicely.
Right, and because I'm looking at the word intpitter again, I think you'd already said it of this intpitter when called outs a thing to pass here, so it's really just what is the thing, give me a thing that I can give back to you in like one moment, so you're responsible for dealing with it.
Correct, and
Okay.
that should be documented. I hope that's documented.
I think you said that in the docs and stuff, so it's that one
Okay.
doesn't need to be spanned because we don't know anything about it, and all we're doing is giving you the pointer. There is no link that we would pass again, so
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's entirely owned by the. That's why it's an out. Yep, that's entirely owned by them.
Yeah, my one nit, like we touched on it, like the for thread, like the set message pending exception for thread, we generally don't, especially in the interrupts namespace, we don't highlight the thread localness of the things that um, set things for current thread. For example, there's like set last error. It's not set last error for thread, right? Or so.
So you want to remove the for thread and just set pending
like
exception?
If it, that would be my nit. I'm not sure whether others agree.
Yeah, that may have been part of the thing that I was asking when I was asking of was it thread, or context of like for thread feels like it needed a parameter of like what thread to do it on.
Yeah, and it's basically just about following patterns. Like we don't. There are many other APIs in the interop namespace that basically set thread local things that don't highlight, hey, this is really for just the current thread. Right?
Yeah, I think I like set message send pending exception better. And again, it says the context will be handled. Just trust us.
Just do the right thing. I agree. That makes sense.
All right. Update. All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, thank you.
That's the wrong red thing. That's the right red thing.
Woot.
We even have 20 minutes left for other stuff. Amazing.
Okay. Symbolic links 24271. Carlos, are you awake?
Hey. Yeah, I'm awake.
Hooray!
Hoping this proposal is going to be a bit easier to digest than the previous one. Can you click on the link at the top of the description? It will take you to the API proposal. Okay. So this is a popular proposal. The request is to add support to create and access symbolic links. As of right now, the only action the user can perform is to check if a file or directory is a symbolic link by creating a file system info instance, calling the attributes property, and checking if it has a file attribute flag called reparse point. So we want to be able to create, and we want to be able to retrieve the target of a symbolic link. The main proposal is to add support to the file system info class, or alternatively to the child classes. And additionally, if possible, we would also like to offer support to the static file system classes, file and directory. I explained them below, or it could be path as well. Yeah, those ones. We want to make sure that to be careful to keep in mind future expansions, because we also have other types of links like junctions. So in the case of the top APIs for file system info, we can add the methods create a symbolic link and get target info. If we add them to file system info, we were thinking about this. It could sound like a kind of an anti-pattern, but we realized there are other methods in file system info that check information of the child classes. Like we have checks everywhere that said, is this a directory info? The advantage of having the methods in file system info, or the main advantage would be when iterating in file system enumerable. Whenever we can, finish checking a file or a directory, we have it in the form of a file system entry, but we have a method that converts it to file system info. So once the user gets that, they can call create a symbolic link, and depending if it's a file or directory, they can create the symbolic link.
Well,
Why the differentiation here?
But
because Windows has two different types of symbolic links.
Right, but if you're enumerating a file system, the file already exists. So is create a symbolic link going to delete the existing file and replace it with a symbolic link? Because create usually throws if the file already exists, right?
Oh, you're right. Okay.
So file system enumeration doesn't make sense as a scenario.
Okay. Yes, you're correct. It makes sense when you retrieve the target info if the file happens to be a symbolic link. Yes. Where was I?
Well, that's the get target info. Get target info totally makes sense,
Yes.
but the create feels like you've said new file system info and given a path. Except you can't say new file system info. You said new.
Yeah, you're right.
New
creation on
file
enumeration doesn't make sense at that point.
Okay. Sorry, continue.
Well, I think that's how the other APIs work, though, right? If you look at directory info, it has a create method. So I think directory infos can exist without a corresponding thing on disk. So when you create a new directory info and you pass a string that doesn't exist yet, exists will return false.
Right.
And then when you call create, it will actually physically create the directory. So it makes sense to call, create symbolic link on an instance that doesn't exist yet, right?
Yeah, I was just confused because we started with if we got a numerator that gives a file system entry, you can convert that to a file system info, but that didn't make sense because that would only be for existing files.
Right. No, yeah, Imo touched that point correctly. It would be the opposite way. You can create a directory info or file info without the file existing. And then if you want to create a symbolic link to that file, then you pass as argument the path to target, the full path of the file that doesn't yet exist. That's how it would make sense. But anyway, the reason why we make the differentiation between file and directory links is because of Windows. It's the most restrictive type of symbolic link. Whereas in Unix, we don't differentiate between symbolic links. So to make sure that we are giving support to Windows correctly, we were thinking to separate the symbolic links for whether directory info or file info.
Sorry, you lost me there. So Windows has the difference between a directory symbolic link and a file directory, file symbolic link?
Yes, correct.
In that it doesn't support directory symbolic links.
Sorry?
Windows has junctions, which are different than symbolic links because they can't go across volumes.
No, there's also junctions. That's the third type of
link. But if my recollection, I mean, maybe new Windows is different, but Windows does not allow symbolic links for directories.
It does.
It does? Okay. Last I knew, make link failed if you give it a directory.
You can use the command mklink. If you use the argument /d, you can create a symbolic link to a directory. If you use /j, you create a junction to a directory.
Okay.
And notably, creating a symbolic link requires administrative privileges unless you go and tweak the setting.
I think in the latest versions of Windows, that's not a requirement anymore. I'm not entirely sure if that's already removed by default, but as far as I remember, yeah, that was the case. I didn't have to tweak the user policies to avoid so that I could create it as a normal user.
So Windows has, as you said, there's junctions and there's also hard links and soft links, right? Does that make a difference?
A hard link is basically creating a new name that points to a location in disk. So you can have two different files that point to the same location in disk, identified by different names. If you edit one, you're going to see the modifications in the other one. But they look like completely independent files. The soft link is another name for symbolic link.
And so, like, which one are we creating here? Like, how do we decide which one to choose?
It's symbolic links only. This proposal is just for symbolic links.
Which is the soft link.
Yeah.
Okay. And so here's if you want the hard link, then You have to literally call in a specific API because we don't have a cross-platform.
We don't
or
have
like
one yet, and we
yeah.
decided not to include it here, but I mentioned them where it says future expansions to keep in mind.
Mhm.
If you can expand that, Jeremy, please. So we could add analogous methods called create junction and create hard link. Create junction obviously would only work on Windows, and create hard link is universal.
So Unix also has the difference between a symbolic link and a hard link then. So
Yes.
it's a okay.
Yeah, and both could
Yeah.
reuse get target info.
Right, because once you have that, yeah. I mean, my question is, once you have multiple things, I mean, because basically right now we don't have really a symbolic link type, right? So we couldn't really expose, well, which kind of link is that kind of thing, right? So if we ever wanted that, then
right. We
I
currently
guess
don't
we could
have
have another
any
method
way to differentiate between a symbolic link and a junction. We only check for the attribute called reparse point, which applies more to Windows because a reparse point is just a additional user information that you add to a file, user-defined data, and depending on the type of object, that user-defined information will tell you if it's a symbolic link or a junction. But yeah, this is specifically just to create the symbolic link. We could also add a, like in the proposal below at the bottom, for file and directory, we would have to add for that scenario a Boolean property that returns if the current file is a symbolic link.
Right.
Because as I mentioned, the only way to check for a symbolic link is through file info or directory info.
Right. And so we could have like is junction is hard link, right? And then, you know, is junction could just always return false on Unix, so it doesn't even have to throw.
Yeah. And
yeah.
well, since I mean we could have junction supported from now, but since that wasn't the main request, and junctions are the legacy kind of symbolic link from Windows, we didn't think it would be as important as adding support for symbolic links right now.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, I don't think anybody is pushing for inclusion. It's more like understanding if we have to grow the design, like how, like would does the shape make sense, or do we regret the shape that we have here, right? But I think the way you have it, I think, you know, we can convince ourselves that we just add new methods and it all still makes sense.
The other reason why in file info and directory info we didn't want to add the is symbolic link property was precisely for what you're just mentioning. If in the future we have junctions, we would rather have, support for junctions, we would rather have an API properly designed that would return you an enum value telling you it's a symbolic link or a junction. But right now, we don't really need that differentiation.
So the idea is basically just return null from get target info if it's not a symbolic link.
If it's not yes, correct. That's why it's nullable.
Right.
So the user would have to check first for the flag, and then get target info would return the target.
And they'll return null if the file doesn't exist, and basically anything other than it's a symbolic link.
Yeah, if the target doesn't exist, which, by the way, is a valid scenario. You can create a symbolic link that points to nothing. You can do it in the command line, both on Windows or on Linux.
Well, but you wouldn't return null then, right? You would return a file system info that is non-null. It's just when you ask exists would return false, right? In this case.
Yeah,
right?
Mine was if you say new file system info of thing that doesn't exist dot get target info, that will return null because file system info that exists returned false.
Yes, correct. So yeah, that would be the same as you know, you instantiated with an actual file that is not a symbolic link, right? So that would be indifferentiable. Yeah. And that seems fine. Yeah, that makes sense. I think I like
just to make sure I understood what Jeremy said. So there are three cases: the file itself exists, the file doesn't exist in which case target info will return null, and the file exists but the target doesn't exist, in which case we would return a file system info instance that doesn't exist. Okay, three cases.
Yeah.
Are we missing an API here for path is equal to say I want to consider reparse points as part of the equality logic?
Good luck with that.
I have a feeling Jeremy K would have a lot to say about the difficulties of that.
Yeah, I think Jeremy K classifies that as like an NP hard problem.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure about what Tanner is asking. So, what would that look like?
So say that you have a symlink, like
Right.
say you've got C users tagu source, and you've got that redirecting to D users tagu source because you don't want a bunch of source repos bloating your SSD.
Right.
But for the purposes of path comparisons, you want to know if the user said C, but I'm seeing D, but the C path actually redirects to D, then treat it as the same. We actually do in a lot of our own like infrastructure scripts path checks of like if the path that was passed in matches the path that the current working directory, then do one thing, otherwise do another thing. And when those account for reparse points, which is common in shell script, then everything works as expected. If we don't account for that, like happens in PowerShell, then bad things happen. And if we had an API, then it would be trivial to, do the right thing everywhere.
I mean, I don't think that. I think the feature you're requesting makes sense. I think it's kind of additional, though. I would not link it to this proposal here. I mean, because it's not that it's bad. It's just feature creep for this one. Yeah, I would just keep this one scoped for, creating symlinks and asking them to exist. You're asking for more like a higher level concept that uses those APIs to do comparisons, right?
Right. It was more a question of like, we're exposing symlinks as a thing in .NET. Are we missing the corresponding functionality that makes it seem like a complete and integrated feature in the ecosystem?
I mean, we kind of have holes already, right? Because we don't really have a path comparer in general, right? Where casing would matter or not matter depending on which part of the path you're looking at, right? And it's a hard problem, right? Because part of the path might be case sensitive, part of the path might be case insensitive, and it's not just if Unix or if Windows, right? It completely depends on which drives you have mounted where.
Because I mean, really, I think that the thing that most people want is when I open this and read, am I reading the same state off of storage?
Right.
Right.
But I don't think that there's anything that you can do with path APIs to answer that, and I think the only way you can really do it is actually to open and then ask, are these two open handles the same state on disk?
Well, the thing that most shell scripts do is basically this snippet, which is, while I am a reparse point, resolve myself until I'm no longer a reparse point. And then path comparison just becomes fully resolve this path, see if they're equal.
Right. So that's the get target
Return
info.
final target. That's the scenario that we handle in get target info. We either return the linked object directly, or we traverse through all the linked symbolic links until we reach a final target. We should also keep in mind cycles here. When discussing this with David Cantu, he solved a similar problem in JSON cycles. So we have an idea of how this could be solved. It could be expensive, but it's something to keep in mind.
And I would assume that most of our APIs that deal with path comparisons would, and it does sound like this is a separate proposal then, but it sounds like they would basically take an additional thing of bool resolve symbolic links. And if that's true, the first thing it would do for each input path is, get target info, get full path.
Yeah, return final target, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think I like the API shape you have here for file system info. I think just from a discoverability standpoint, I think I would also want the static methods on file and directory. Because, I mean, it just, I don't know, like I barely ever work with file system infos directly. I almost always use the static ones.
Yes.
And just from a consistency standpoint, it seems weird to do half the work and not the other half. Like,
I do. So I'm scrolling down and looking at this one now. Like the create symbolic link being on both places is fine. No one will understand which order the two parameters go in, but that's okay because no one understands the order the two parameters go into the ln-s command on Linux. So I do see that you have a parity mismatch of the get symbolic link target here. It uses symbolic link target instead of target, and meaning it shouldn't go through junctions, I guess. And it doesn't take the Boolean. And then now you have this question: is symbolic link, where on file system info you just had am I a reparse point, which is multiple kinds of link. So is this one supposed to be extremely specific, or is it actually a reparse
specific,
point?
Correct. Yes. Just for support for this scenario, another way to solve this would be to have, like I said, an enum, and check if it's, or make the method return the type of link we're dealing with. And regarding the name of the other method, get symbolic link target. Yes, the idea is that we would only return something if it's a symbolic link.
Okay, so these two are explicitly expected to only be about symbolic links and not about the more generalized problem of one thing is really being another thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if you disagree, that's a valid point.
The words were different, and if the concept is different, then the words being different is great. It's if the words were different, but the concept is the same is the problem.
Right. Also, an alternative to having those methods created on file or directory would be to have them in path, and we could internally determine on Windows if the path we're talking about, the path that we want to create a link for is a directory or a file, and the user would not have to care about that. It's either or. We could have file directory and or path. So
my recollection was that Windows didn't allow symlinks to directories, but since that's no longer true, can you create a symlink on Windows that points to a non-existent file?
Yes, I actually tried it earlier today, and
does Windows make a distinction between symbolic directories and symbolic files? Because if so, if you create one and you don't know what kind it is, you're going to have to pick one, which means it wouldn't work on path.
On path, it will work if you return a file system info. The user would have to cast it to something specific, but they would still return something valid. They wouldn't know at the moment if it's a file, if the target was a file or a directory, but they would have to cast it.
Okay, so Windows does not have that the directory entry type is symbolic directory versus symbolic file. It's just symbolic.
Yeah, it basically returns what you're pointing at, right? It's either if you point to a file, you get back a file. If you point to a directory, you get a directory, right?
And if you point to nothing, you get a file.
I think that's the case. If the target didn't exist, then there has to be a default, right? I think it's
so really it was a question of here for path.create symbolic link. If Windows had symbolic file as a different kind of node than symbolic directory, then you wouldn't know what kind of thing you were making. And that was my question. Because you can't depend on this existing.
on path, because path today is just a class that
Works on
there's
strings.
some that actually do I/O, but most of them are just parsing, right? And generally speaking, it's bad enough that some do I/O, but we should probably not have I/O that actually has side effects and create stuff on disk. That seems
Fair enough.
unfortunate.
The create methods for directories and files do not live in path; they live in file and directory. So if we want to keep it similar or analogous, file and directory seem the better choice.
The is symbolic link could make sense on path because it's answering a question about a path. I don't have strong feelings there.
Independent of the type, on Windows at least.
But it would depend on if we have other members on path that answer data about a path instead of just manipulate a path.
Yeah.
Sorry, if they... Because I think most of the things on path are about, where do slashes go and how do you pop off and what's an extension mean, and it doesn't ever say anything about the contents. If it does, then is symbolic link could go here, and that's fine.
I mean, the one downside of putting it on file directory is that if there's code that doesn't know whether the target is a file or directory, then you have to ask upfront if it's a file, and then call file.create symbolic link, and otherwise call directory.create symbolic link, right? That's the But that seems kind of rare because most of the time you know what you want to do.
It's a question that was asked in the chat in YouTube. How if you used the path method to create a symbolic link on Unix, for example, and it points to a file without extension, since we don't differentiate, what would it return? But I think we could, before creating it, we have to stat the file. Yeah, we just stat, and that would return if it's a directory or a file.
Yeah, and what is the create symbolic link returning?
Create symbolic link, a directory info that grabs the target. No, sorry, create symbolic link.
Grabs the path.
So it creates the link at this path and then says new directory info of path.
It returns a directory info that points to the link you just created that points to another file, a target, which happens to be a directory.
Okay, so it returns the thing you created. So it does always have a return value.
Yes.
Okay.
And presumably, you basically it already exists, right? So it will always return true for exists. Because you just manufactured it, right?
I mean,
the file itself would exist. The link will always exist. The target doesn't have to exist.
Yeah, and technically, I don't think that the file system infos populate themselves until you ask the first member. So, because of race conditions, it could not exist by the time that you ask exists. But
sure.
But in a single-threaded universe that makes sense, exists would always return true.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I think it all makes sense. So basically, we would have like file info, directory info, file and directory, and they each have two methods. And we probably should align the names, right? So we call it always create symbolic link. We always call it get symbolic link target.
Right. Well, so I'm wondering. So we have file system info create as symbolic link, which operates off of the path information stored in this.
Yes.
If we're concerned about the it's weird file.create symbolic link and directory.create symbolic link, we could do file system info.create without the word as symbolic link, which takes the two things. Now we're not having the same method group have a instance and static, but we have the static without the word as of go do this thing, and then the instance of you don't exist, go populate yourself. And I think that would be fine.
Sorry, I did not follow what you said. What is it you're proposing?
Well, we said it was weird for file.create symbolic link because you need to, it can't actually return a file info it can. But I don't even know what it would do if you say file.create symbolic link, you give it a name and it points to a directory. Is that going to blow up because what it wants to return now is a directory info?
I think it will fail. Yeah, you cannot.
Well, it will have created it. The create would
Well, okay,
succeed
it
unless
could
you
be
fail
created,
at
but
the
once you
stat.
call get target info, that's where you could have the error. The exception maybe. MK link, if you create on Windows a link without a /d argument, which indicates that the target is a directory, and you point it to a directory, then you get an error.
Okay, but if
I
you
think we can
create it
solve
to a
this
link
very
that doesn't
simple,
exist
actually.
and then you create that target as a directory, what happens?
If you
I think it's very simple for us to fix. All we have to do is, instead of returning file and directory info, we just return file system info. And we can just say whatever you're pointing to is what we return. And so we just have to say, if the link path doesn't exist, fine. Then we just return you in a file info where exists returns false, right? Because we just had to pick one of the two.
Sure, but
otherwise
so
you
then
just
do we
create the
just
corresponding
delete the one on directory and we just say directories are files for purposes of symbolic link creating?
Well, I would just say when you say file, I would probably still keep them both, and I would just make them both do the same thing, honestly, because it doesn't really matter.
Right, because that's going to be the same thing here with this symbolic link. Like, there was nothing about a directory involved in this. It's just a path. The only thing it
Yeah.
could do is say, you called the directory one, and this is a file. Well, it doesn't even make sense. It's a symbolic link. So, yeah, I mean, we can leave it on both. But do we want all three on both, where the two info things are file system info?
Before you mentioned, at least symbolic link could make sense to add it to path. Is that what you said?
If path ever answers any questions about the target of a link instead of just about the construction of the string. I don't know if it does. Path.combine, which is now the better one is path.join, is the only thing I use path for. So I don't know if path answers questions about the target. I don't think it does. It looks like it's all just string manipulation.
Another option is to, going back to what Emo says, create symbolic link, return a file system info, which could also mean that we can avoid having three methods in directory, because we're passing a path and it doesn't matter what it is. It will return a file system info. If it's on Windows and target happens to be a directory, it should succeed even if we're calling it from the file class.
Yeah, I mean, we can basically decide to only have it on directory and only have it on file, or having it on both, but basically they would always do the exact same thing, right? Because it's effectively, depending on what path to target resolves to, either return a file, file info or directory info, right? It just means you can't be lazy, right? But that's okay, probably.
I'm inclined to have it only on file and return file system info and not have the directory methods.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what your logical model is, right? I mean, I probably would call it on directory rather than file. But
it feels noisy on Windows since we have the differentiation, but yeah, I don't know why Windows decided to do that. Oh, and going back to the main proposal, is it okay? Does it make sense to have it on file system info? We will still have to check if we're dealing with a directory or a file, and it sounds like information that belongs to the child classes. But as I mentioned, we already have methods in file system info that do a lot of checks like that. Is this a directory info? Then we go through this path. Otherwise, the other path.
So I don't know, like, do you want to support the scenario where you can create a symbolic link with a path that doesn't exist yet?
Yeah, it would be parity to a command line.
Because I guess the problem is if you're on a directory info, right, and then you call create symbolic link, and then the path doesn't resolve, Well, we don't know whether we're actually creating a directory or a file, right?
Yeah, it's
So
true.
it's a
Well,
bit of
you could call create a symbolic link and point it on directory info, create a link to dev null, and then ask a directory question, and now it's probably going to explode. Because you've changed the instant. I mean, it would be the same as if you get the directory info from enumeration, haven't read any of the members, remove the directory, and then create a file of the same name. That probably blows up horribly. So maybe we don't want the instance methods.
I mean, there's another option we have. We can just say.
Sorry, we don't want
maybe
the
we
instance
should have-
create. The instance get target info seems fine.
I mean, maybe we should just have a new class called symbolic link, and then there's also symbolic link info that derives file system info, and so all symbolic links are their own thing, and basically they are neither directories nor their files. They are symbolic links, and then the only thing that is either a file or a symbolic link or a directory is the target itself, right? And then it's actually kind of reasonable because then
issue with that, just thinking out loud, is we already have directory.enumerate. It already sees symbolic links and returns them as files or directories.
oh fuck yeah.
Like we have a hierarchy that can't expand because we've basically, like, everybody's
So
probably
the
written it
files
as either or as this else, right? And I mean, we can try introducing it and breaking the world. We can also try introducing it and just not returning it from the enumerators, or it returns symbolic link if it's a dangling link.
No, I think that's probably bad. So I think at this point, we probably just have to make a decision and say symbolic links are always either files or directories, right? And then we
The
just
link
treat it as
itself,
that.
right? And the target
Yeah.
can be either a directory or a file.
Yeah.
But the link is a file. That would make sense.
Unless we've already done something different with enumeration. Like, I feel like in Linux you can name a symbolic link ending with a slash, which is a, like, hint I expect this to be a directory, but I don't think it has to be. And then you just get in a weird state. I could be wrong. It could be that ls puts the slash on there when it sees the target as a directory. But
I mean, you're kind of screwed, right? Because what happens if you do directory.enumerate directories, right? And now in that thing you have a symbolic link that points to a directory.
right,
We
like,
can't return that now.
indeed. I assume we have a behavior for when we see symbolic links right now, and I don't think we can change that. We just need, like, this is new metadata on it, which makes the get target info here makes total sense to me. If you're a symbolic link, go tell me where you point. 100% no problem. The create on the file system info instance is complicated because you can inherently change which type of thing it believes it is when you call that create, and that feels weird. So
Right.
if we
that
wanted
makes
the-
more sense to put it down in the file info or directory info.
But again, that doesn't make sense because you can say file info create a symbolic link and then you point to a directory. Like, sure, we can make that throw of here, like, sorry, you pointed to the wrong thing, which is what Windows make link is doing. But otherwise, I think the creating the link just needs to be the static.
I think the problem in practice is like, I think when you look at Windows, right, like, if you know, the current situation is, right, if you do directory.get child directories, we will return directory infos for symbolic links if they're resolved to a directory, right? So I think the problem really is that the only scenario that is ill-defined here is the creating a symbolic link to a thing that doesn't exist yet. So the question really is if you create a symbolic link using the Windows APIs that resolves to nothing, what does directory enumerate files and basically what does it do? Does it include it at all? My assumption is it would show up neither as a subdirectory nor as a file, because it's neither a file nor a directory, right? It just points to nothing. In which case, maybe that's okay. Maybe we can just say our APIs just don't support creating a symbolic link for a target that doesn't exist yet. Like, you have to, we can say we do support it, but we will create the target, right?
Maybe.
It needs to be a file or directory at the time you create it, because otherwise we don't know what to do.
Right. This is simply if you say file info.create a symbolic link and target happens to be a directory, then we can't populate the file info members. They don't make sense anymore.
Correct.
And so that's why, like, I'm just saying for create, if we get rid of it on file system info and just leave it as file.create symbolic directory, there's no ambiguity. So I just want the create methods off of the file system info types.
Or just on file info, and as you mentioned, get target info stays in file system
But that doesn't make
info.
sense.
Because we can consider links in themselves.
I mean, I guess that's true. We can support always opening a link as a file info, and then also if it is a symbolic link that points to a directory, also interpreting it as a directory info. But like that's weird.
No, I don't think we can
it's
do
a
that
file info
because the
pointed
thing
to a
is-
directory, so don't
Right.
follow
So I
it
think
because
that-
you're a file info.
So I think the problem is that might be a breaking change, right? Because the question is, if I'm on .NET 5, right, where we don't have those APIs, and I do directory.enumerate files, and there's a symbolic link that happens to point to a file, it will return this as a file info, right? Because the thing it points to is a file. Now, if you have a symbolic link that points to a directory, I'm pretty certain that enumerate files won't return it in .NET 5, right? It will return it as part of directory. We just don't know it is a symbolic link, right? And so the thing is, you can't treat a symbolic link as a file always, because I think it depends on what it points to, what it's being treated at. And so that's, I think, the problem in the design here is that, and I'm pretty sure also if the thing doesn't resolve, it will neither show up in files or directories. We should probably test it on .NET 5 what actually happens with the normal Windows enumeration APIs that don't know about symbolic links. But that's why I think you can't treat them as always files. You would have to treat them as what is it they're pointing to, because that's effectively what they are. And I think that kind of makes me believe that the design that we have is just, when you create one, you have to make a decision what it is, and then it's immutable. And so we can't have the create method on file system info. I mean, we can, but we would then have to check whether it actually is the right type, right? And that seems a bit odd, maybe, but it's probably not the worst in the world either.
Well, if you're enumerating and you check if the file is a symbolic link, then you can call get target info, and you know that you may get something valid. And since we're expected to return file system info, we check if it's a file or a directory, and then if it's a directory, we can go deeper into it if we were iterating recursively. I don't know if that makes sense. So the file info grabbing the link itself can be a file. We check if it's a link, and then we get the target info, which could be a file system info. If that object happens to be a directory, we can recurse into it.
I don't think you can do that. So the question is, what
really the question is, what do we do today?
Files do? Yeah, exactly. So because you're constrained by what the version of .NET that didn't know about symbolic links did, right? And I think the problem is if you recurse in, you might return a different name now, right? Because the thing you're pointing to has a different name, right? So that you have to return the thing as if it were existing in the place you're asking. And that means you need to create the correct instance of file system info at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, if you ask Windows, is the symbolic link a file or directory? I'm pretty sure Windows will effectively do that recursion for you. Right, so you don't have to do anything. You can just be dumb, honestly. Like I think that the big problem here, realistically, is just we can't have a create symbolic link info, create symbolic link API on file system info, unless we're willing to check, does the path resolve to the correct type, and if so, let it succeed. I mean, we could decide and say if the thing doesn't exist, we also let it succeed because, well, if it doesn't exist, it could either be a file or directory, but it doesn't really matter, right? So you would only say if the thing exists and it is the right thing, then succeed. Otherwise, throw, right?
Right. Yes.
In which case, it seems fine. And then file and directory, the static things would always succeed because they give you back the appropriate instance. So there's no.
Yeah. It's up to the user if they want to cast it or not.
Right. If they care.
Exactly. What about naming? What do you think about the names?
That is a good question. I mean, I really like create without the as because we don't have it in the other APIs either.
We have a create for file info and directory info.
Right, and so I would just have create symbolic link. I would just not have the as in it.
Well, the word as is explaining that it's the difference between creating as a normal file or as a symbolic link. That's why we decided to add it.
Well, I mean, like I think you're providing that information by the suffix of symbolic link, right? If you just call it create, then yeah, that would be weird, right? But like you call it create symbolic link, so it's kind of clear that you're creating a symbolic link, right? So to me, the as just doesn't add anything. It just
to me, it does add something once you're on directory info, because create symbolic link could be add a symbolic link into this directory instead of manifest this entry as a symbolic link.
I mean, I think it's the same, honestly, because I mean, both have a create method, right? Which basically means create a directory or create a file.
But they have a create that takes no arguments, so there's no room for ambiguity.
Right, and then this one is basically saying you create a symbolic link and you take the argument for where it points to, right? So
yeah, I guess it's just the code review thing, right? You see new directory info of home/emo/foo, and then dot create symbolic link, and then you see like that goes off the right hand side of the screen. Is that creating emo foo as a symbolic link, or is that creating a symbolic link under the directory emo foo? So it's creating emo foo bar points to dev null. I just like it. You can infer it by the number of arguments it took. It's not as obvious as create as to me, where it's saying like the thing that I am is about to become different.
Sure. I mean, yeah.
I don't feel strongly. I feel that the as does have some value.
I mean, to me, the reason why I wouldn't have it is because I would want symmetry between the static ones and the non-static ones.
Oh, but that's different because you are passing two arguments in that case. So you want to create a symbolic link of this path that points to the file in this target. That's the slight difference.
No, but I think but the only reason you take two arguments is because you don't have a dispointer, right? The dispointer is the first argument, right? Yeah. So that's why, to me, it makes sense to have symmetry in the naming.
That's fair. I guess I had also, in the middle, suggested that the static live on file system info instead of on file or directory, and so the as was the instancy one and the non-as-y one was the static-y one. But
yeah. I mean, I also like the other name you had for the target info one, like was it get symbolic link target or whatever? That makes more sense to me than get target info.
The thing about the file system info version is that if we want to expand to support junctions, get target info is generic enough independently of the type of link we're dealing with. If it's a symbolic link or a junction, we would return something valid.
I guess. I mean, yeah, I guess if you want to differentiate between junctions and symbolic links, then maybe. I mean, I kind of suspect once we have support for junctions that we probably have to add another API anyway that gives you a bit more information about what the thing actually is.
Right, well, that's what I had asked in the other one of file.isSymbolicLink will return false for junctions.
Right, and so I would probably say get target info would also return null for junctions. That's a different thing you have to ask, basically. And maybe we have an Uber thing then that works for everything and then gives you back the target path and the kind or something, right? And then,
right, yeah.
Fair enough.
So I would probably just call it get symbolic link target and make it just return file system info question mark.
Okay.
So I just pasted in chat what I think this should look like, based on what I heard.
You say you pasted in chat, but I don't see it.
Wrong
Am I in
chat.
the wrong meeting? No. Oh, it's. I have to hit select enter because it's.
You're still in the code edit
stupid
mode.
Teams. Yeah, exactly. So here we go. There's like too many nested panels. It's like I don't understand what I'm looking at.
Okay. File system
Does that
info
make
has the
sense?
two methods, and then file and directory also have two methods. What about the is symbolic link for file and for directory?
I would just say call get symbolic link target and check whether it's a null. Like, why would you only care whether it is one? You probably want to know what it's pointing to too, right?
Depends. Things like ls just paint it a different color and don't care if it, I mean, depending on your ls color options, it'll paint it a different color if the target doesn't exist. But
yeah, the link can exist, and well, we would still return something if we call directory dot get symbolic link target or file get symbolic link target. It just would have nothing returning the target info. It would be null.
Right. I mean, it is literally the null check, right? Because it would have the exact same semantics, right?
no,
So,
yeah, it's fine. And if you wanted the, yeah, so it's the boolean with the answer. So
yeah.
if we feel that the object creation is too expensive, we can add a thing later. But you did IO. It probably wasn't the object creation that killed you.
Yeah, that was
that's kind of
the thing. The concern was having to create an instance of directory info instead of just checking with true or false.
I mean, true, but at the same time, like directory dot create, for example, returns the directory info today, right? So like, I mean, for better or worse, the pattern, and even in the static ones, is that they will generally create these info objects. So, I mean, I still have trouble believing that this is, as you said, the performance bottleneck, because if you do this in a tight loop, you have other issues, right? Like, it's probably the IO is the thing that kills you, not the, oh my God, I just allocated a object that has like 6 fields or something.
Yep, and is lazy, so it didn't matter anyway.
Right. Okay.
I mean, the one question we probably want overloads for all of them that take strings would be my guess, but
initially I had them as strings, but what would be the argument in favor of that?
That if you don't work on our team, you don't know what span is.
Yeah, this would be the only span APIs on this type, and given that the scenario for this is probably where you're already doing some really heavy inspection of these things, like, you're not really in a low allocation scenario.
Do we not have, so nothing on these takes spans at all? We decided full manifest strings are fine?
I didn't see anything in APIs of .NET, so either I looked at the wrong, if there are existing span APIs, either I looked at the wrong thing or it hasn't been updated.
No, I think Levi is right. We only have them on path because the expectation, because path is just in-memory manipulation and parsing, right? And that's where we actually have spans. But I think for file and directory, where you actually do I/O, we never added span-based overloads because, well, you do I/O, so who cares?
Okay, so I replaced all Ross chars with string in Notepad.
Okay.
I mean, like, even if we had spans, we would also want strings because not all languages support it, and like, so
it's the question of overloading versus replacing here. So
exactly. So I would just start with strings only. We can always add the span ones later if we ever really need to.
Okay, good point.
Okay, so I thought we'd said we were getting rid of the static methods off of directory because they were redundant, but Emo put them back. So
yeah, to me, it's kind of like they would do the same thing. It's just I think it depends on your mental model which one you would call, right? I mean,
fair enough.
I don't have strong opinions. It's just I mean, yeah, it's weird either way, but like, I don't know. Like, I mean, we can decide to keep it only on one, but then could we get a vote where we all agree on what the one is that would make sense to us? I don't know. I would probably leave it on directory because my mental model is I create something in some directory, right? But that's.
I mean, I would leave it on file because generally, if I'm symlinking something, it's a file.
Yeah, I would also leave it in file and make it return file system info.
Emo already had that in his update.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Because really, they're just like one of them's just going to call the other.
Yeah.
or they're both going to call the same implementation with no extra validity, which is why it's weird because we generally don't do that. But this is it doesn't actually pertain to either files or directories, but those are the two places that you would go to look for it. So it's fine. The note that I had taken was we can add it back later if there's pushback, and I think emo adding it back in the proposal was pushback. So.
Yeah, honestly, I didn't know that we had contention here. Like, yeah, to me, as Jamie said, like, it's just the two places you look, so seems logical.
Okay, so I guess we got it down to a point where we actually don't care what happens for things. Well, one of the things that I had in the middle is the fact that we didn't know how enumerate files.
Still care, right?
Yeah, we didn't know how enumerate files behaves right now in 5, and that was causing us problems of thinking about things like this. But the answer is,
I mean, we should probably still check, right? So like after Carlos wrote all the code, we should probably run the code on 6 and run the code on 5 and see whether we return the same results. Because I mean,
sure. But this is we ended up. Because we thought about adding the symbolic link info, but then we're like, that's probably going to break enumerate file system or enumerate files or directory.enumerate, which gives back both. And like, is that going to cause things? And I think we ended up going into a world where we needed to know how these things worked, and then got back out of it before when we were done. So.
Well, I mean, I think we just asserted a mode in which they work, right? But I think
Right. Well, because now we just say like because it's directory.create symbolic link that returns file system info, our answer is we don't care. It does something. We're not asserting it returns directories. We're not saying it has to. We're not like whatever we do for enumerate, that's what we're going to do from here, basically.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And then and similarly for get symbolic link target. The one thing that I want to ask, even though we're now half an hour over, is on file system info, we added the recur option, and on file, we're making you just call it yourself in a loop. Do we think we want the recur option on file? And
no,
on both of them, do we want it as a optional parameter?
Yeah, return final target should also be added to the file and directory ones. I missed those.
Yeah,
Thanks for
and do we want
it
it defaulted to false because we don't think people generally care to think about it?
The argument in favor of setting it to false is that PowerShell, someone working on PowerShell down below mentioned that they do not look, they avoid cycles by setting this to false, also because it's expensive. So it could be false by default, yeah. But
yeah. I mean, like the question is, do we want it as a formal parameter or as a defaulted parameter? I think if it's defaulted, false is the sensible default.
You're inclined to have it false, okay.
But if we think that it should just be a formal parameter that everybody has specified, that's fine too.
I mean, I would probably default it to false because it's just I mean, I don't know. There's probably cases where you want the final target, but like it is way more expensive.
Yes.
And so I would just say, yeah, if you really care, then sure. But
yeah,
most of the time,
true
you
is
know...
I'm willing to do more work.
Yes.
Right.
It's just the question of is false common enough that we want it as a default. I think probably yes. But I only ask questions.
And also the safest option in case there are cycles.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It will never throw, right? It will always give you back a result instantaneously. So yeah.
Well, I mean, the other answer is no default, and we just make the user specify it. But I think it's fine to default to false.
I'm okay either way. I feel like you're more inclined to having false, so.
Yeah.
I probably would set it to false, by default. It is a bit more in line what we do in other places, right? Directory delete where recursion is an optional argument, basically, and we default to none. So seems reasonable. Cool. Seems like we have something that we all like.
Nice.
No, we only have to implement it correctly.
Yeah, I'll keep in mind to be careful with enumeration. I know that file system enumerable is flexible enough to let us check if we want to traverse the symbolic links or not. But obviously the directory ones are the ones that need to have the same behavior.
Yeah. So you have a proposal here saying that you'll throw a few detect cycles, correct?
It's an option, yeah, to throw.
I mean, you can do that with a stack. The way that JSON detects cycles isn't actually detecting cycles. It says I'm only willing to do 50 things.
Yeah, I think that's the best thing to do, honestly, because I can very easily imagine this ending up like in service code, like as a Windows service, for instance, where they start looking over a directory and some malicious local user with low privileges has just spammed 20,000 symlinks into a single folder trying to Stack Overflow the process.
Okay.
So
we could document a limit of checks we could do.
That it throws after 10 or 50 or
like
whatever.
Some number of few, like, to be honest, like, no one should ever do more than 3, to be perfectly honest. But if you wanted to be nice to your users, you could say, like, you know what, we'll cap it at 32. If we see more than that, screw it, we're gone.
Yeah, and anybody who cares to go higher can do it themselves with calling it one by one with false. So
yeah,
it's a little more expensive because they have to get the file system info object instead of the inode, but whatever.
You'd also want to document, like, do you follow UNC paths if someone does a symlink? Because I believe symlinks can actually go across volumes because they're not junctions, correct?
They do, yeah.
I mean, on Linux they certainly can because the UNC path is just another mount point.
Yeah. So you would absolutely want. I'm again, just from a security hat on, I can easily imagine services calling into this where the input files are untrusted. So there would have to be a warning block on here saying, like, hey, if you're a service and you don't trust the path that's being passed to you, you really don't want to pass true in for this parameter because it could do some really crazy things.
Good point. Yeah.
Along those lines, actually, when you are getting the destination of a symlink, you actually should not attempt any type of resolution without the explicit consent of the caller. So if a symlink does point to a UNC path, for instance, you should feel free to return the UNC path to the caller and potentially even say, like, here's, return it in a nice structure, but under no circumstance should we ever attempt to actually hit it, like to actually make a network connection to that UNC share without the caller taking another explicit action saying, yes, I want you to do that.
Yeah, I mean, probably the first thing they'll do is call exists, which will do the UNC walk, but they had the option to ask, is it a UNC path before they did that.
But they called exist, that's okay.
Yep.
Like they could have called, like you said, as UNC path.
All right. So
there's lots of opinion on documentation. Okay, I'll talk him when the time
It's just
comes.
because I've seen, like, I've been involved with lots of different MSRCs along these lines with regard to, like, impersonation, network shares, everything else, and APIs like this tend to be the things that bite those services.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, looking at it, I feel that the as belongs in the instance member. Create as symbolic link, but me saying it now is the last that I'll bring it up.
I also think, at least in the file system info, should we convince Imo? What do you need for us to convince
you? If you feel super strongly, like, I will not, like, flip a table on that one. It just, to me, I don't know. I generally appreciate symmetry, and so I have a natural tendency to do that, but
it's just the fact that it's doing this other weird thing. Like, you're not asking the file to create a symbolic link. You're telling the file system info to create itself as a symbolic link. And that's where it's... You're not asking the file system info to do... or the file that it represents to do work. So we have file system or directory info enumerate directories, right? You're asking about the contents of the directory to do something. The only verb that's not about the contents is create, which took no parameters. And so create symbolic link feels like, especially for if you're a directory, it feels like, again, like it wants to create an entry in the directory that is a symbolic link.
So could we come up with a name that we could have the same across all three of them? So for example, imagine we would call it create symbolic link 2. Would that help?
I think that being create symbolic link as the static is fine, and create as symbolic link on the instance tells you what it's doing to the instance. It's manifesting the instance as a symbolic link. I think it's correct that they're not the same.
They are not symmetric exactly. So it
Well,
also
I
makes
guess
sense to
what
me
I'm
to add
asking is,
as.
like, could we come up with a name that would make sense for all three of them, and that would be the same? Like, that's why I'm asking. Like, if you call it create symbolic link 2, would that help? But I guess the answer to that is no.
I mean, if we called it create symbolic link, which only had one argument, and create symbolic link 2 that had 2 arguments, yes, except we don't need a reason to count the number of arguments in our functions. So,
No, not TWO, right? Like just TO.
yeah, I definitely heard Zwei. So, create symbolic link Zwei. It's like, no.
No. I'm not that crazy.
Okay, so create symbolic link TO.
I guess on the aesthetics it's a bit odd now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I don't care. I don't care enough, I guess.
All right, so we have two
then
don't care a lots that like the as and one that doesn't, and everyone else has left the call because we're 40 minutes over.
so then
the as's have it.
Symbolic link. Yeah. It is what it is.
All right. So for anyone who's still watching live, I don't know why, but thank you for joining us. And for anyone who's watching recording, you probably just skipped to this part. So we don't have a session on Friday, I don't think. Right, Nemo? We don't have one tomorrow.
We do no tomorrow
Okay.
is or.
But next week we have a session on Monday instead of Tuesday. So for anyone who wants to join us live, that is 10 a.m. Monday Pacific time, because we have conflicts on Tuesday.
Correct.
So see you then.
Well, thank you.
Hello, hello,